The Spanish Guerrilla War that erupted with the invasion of Spain in 1808 represented a revolutionary and unprecedented form of resistance that transformed what Napoleon and his generals had expected to be a swift conquest into a prolonged, exhausting, and ultimately disastrous campaign. The French, confident in their military superiority and accustomed to quick victories over traditional armies, marched into Spain expecting minimal resistance. They had already defeated the regular Spanish forces in several early encounters and assumed that the population, demoralized and disorganized, would either submit or accept a new political order under Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, whom he installed as king. However, what they encountered instead was a country that refused to bow, a society that rose up almost spontaneously to challenge the occupation, and a form of warfare that was unlike anything the French had faced in the open fields of Europe. The Spanish resistance was not limited to a single organized army. It was a broad, popular, and decentralized uprising that included peasants, townspeople, clergy, and former soldiers, creating a complex network of opposition that extended across the Iberian Peninsula. The fighting was no longer confined to set-piece battles, fortresses, or lines of infantry. It took place in the mountains, forests, villages, and roads, where small groups of determined fighters could strike, vanish, and reappear in unexpected places, creating an atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty and fear for the French forces. This form of irregular warfare, which came to be known as guerrilla warfare, literally little war, allowed Spanish fighters to exploit their knowledge of the terrain, their proximity to local resources, and the support of the population, turning the geography itself into a weapon. The guerrilla bands were diverse. Some were former soldiers familiar with military discipline. Others were ordinary peasants who had taken up arms in desperation or outrage, and yet others were opportunist bandits who saw an opportunity for profit, revenge, or notoriety. Despite this diversity, these groups often developed coordination and strategy over time, learning from each encounter how best to strike, retreat, and survive. They focused on ambushes, raids on supply lines, sabotage of convoys and depots, attacks on isolated detachments, and disruption of communication routes. Each small action might seem inconsequential on its own, but collectively, these tactics imposed severe logistical challenges on the French army, preventing it from consolidating its control over the territory and forcing it to divert resources to protect lines of supply and communication rather than pursue offensive operations. In addition to these material effects, guerrilla warfare exacted a profound psychological toll on the French. Soldiers could never feel safe, for attacks could come from any direction at any time by people who blended seamlessly into the civilian population. Constant vigilance, fear of ambush, and the unpredictability of the resistance created a state of continuous anxiety and exhaustion, eroding morale and contributing to a sense of futility among the occupying troops. Even when the French achieved victories in traditional battles, these successes were often hollow, as guerrilla fighters would return to harass, sabotage, and undermine control, demonstrating that military triumph did not equate to effective occupation. The 2 May 1808 uprising in Madrid exemplified the spirit and intensity of the popular resistance. What began as a spontaneous, largely civilian revolt against French authority, brutally suppressed in the streets of the capital, ignited widespread uprisings across the country. The revolt inspired a wave of local insurrections and encouraged the formation of organized and semi-organized guerrilla bands throughout Spain. The French quickly realized that controlling territory required enormous numbers of troops simply to maintain order, guard supply lines, protect communication networks, and secure towns and villages, stretching their forces thin and leaving them vulnerable to persistent attacks. The guerrilla war was thus not a marginal phenomenon. It was the backbone of a national resistance movement that undermined French power even in areas where conventional armies had been defeated. while formal Spanish forces suffered repeated setbacks against the superior French army. Guerrilla fighters ensured that occupation was never secure, that no territory could be considered entirely pacified, and that defeat in open battle did not mean submission of the population. This combination of conventional and irregular resistance created a situation in which France was forced into a protracted campaign with no clear front lines, constant attrition, and a population that refused to yield, making Spain, in effect, Napoleon's Vietnam. Unlike previous European wars in which the French had relied on disciplined formations and decisive battles to secure victory, in Spain they confronted a form of warfare in which victory in one place could be immediately undermined elsewhere, and in which the enemy was diffuse, mobile, and embedded within the civilian population. The impact of guerrilla warfare extended beyond tactical and psychological effects. It had strategic consequences that shaped the course of the Peninsular War. Napoleon was compelled to commit disproportionate numbers of troops to the peninsula, weakening his capacity to operate effectively on other fronts and prolonging the conflict to the detriment of his broader campaigns. The war became a grinding struggle of attrition, in which French resources were steadily drained by constant skirmishes, ambushes, and the necessity of garrisoning key positions. The presence of guerrillas ensured that atrocities and reprisals became a recurring element of the conflict, which in turn fueled further resistance, creating a cycle of violence that hardened the determination of the Spanish people, rather than breaking it. The French army, despite its initial successes, found itself trapped in a hostile environment, perpetually reacting rather than controlling the situation, and gradually losing the initiative as the cumulative effects of the guerrilla campaign, combined with the efforts of allied British and Portuguese forces, wore down its strength and will. The enduring legacy of the Spanish Guerrilla War lies not only in its immediate military consequences, but also in its influence on the concept of popular resistance and irregular warfare in modern history. For the first time in Europe, a people's widespread, decentralized, and persistent resistance managed to frustrate and eventually contribute decisively to the defeat of a major conventional army. The conflict demonstrated that the will of a population, when combined with tactical ingenuity and an intimate knowledge of the land, could outweigh superior numbers, technology, and formal military training. The Spanish guerrillas redefined warfare by showing that control of territory was not simply a matter of defeating armies in open battle, but depended on securing the loyalty, cooperation, or submission of the people themselves, and that a determined populace could make occupation a living nightmare for any invader. In summary, the Spanish Guerrilla War transformed Napoleon's campaign in Spain into an arduous, prolonged struggle in which the French army, despite its superiority in training, numbers, and equipment, was unable to impose lasting control. The combination of popular uprising, irregular tactics, and relentless attrition created a conflict that drained resources, sapped morale, and ultimately contributed to the expulsion of French forces from the Iberian Peninsula. It was a seminal moment in military history, demonstrating the power of decentralized, popular resistance and leaving an enduring legacy in the study of warfare, strategy, and the relationship between armies and the societies they attempt to subjugate. The term guerrilla itself, originating from this period, encapsulates a form of warfare that relies on mobility, surprise, local support, and unconventional tactics, a model that would influence resistance movements and insurgencies around the world for centuries to come, and one that rendered Spain the first true example of a nation capable of turning occupation into an intractable, exhausting, and ultimately victorious struggle.